Hello, very beautiful community. Let me know if you can see and hear me. And we're going to have a chat about having entered the fifth year of the full scale Russo Ukrainian war. It's a moment to take stock, and it's a moment to reflect on what might happen next. And it's a moment to reflect both on our shock about what happened in 2022, but also in what lessons we have learned that have given us a different perspective on it since what happened 4 years ago. Now, what I want from you is to let me know if you can see and hear me. This is probably going to be a smaller group because we haven't done a live on the main channel for a long time. But let me just say a few things with broad brushstrokes before we go on and take some questions. Let me say something political. Let me then say something psychological, and then let me say something maybe personal. Now, politically, we are seeing several processes. Let me name just two. We're seeing the decline of the Russian Empire. That's a decline that's happening in a self-destructive way. What Russia is doing is going to be enormously damaging to it over the medium term, the course of decades, not years, and might even endanger its survival as a country. That's not a process that takes place over the course of a year or two or 5 or 7. It's a longer range process. We're also seeing the collapse of the what was left of the Western-backed international order, secondary to democratic decline domestically in Western societies. That's also a process that's just beginning. So essentially what we're looking at is not something that's going to land, as it were, in the next year or 2 or 3. We are at the beginning of a process that's going to be witnessed across many more years than that. Let me then say something psychological. We live in a political time without a future. Russia, of course, is an extreme example of that. It has no conception of its own future and no conception of even, indeed, what it has anybody to offer in the present that's compelling. The West has no conception of a future because most of us are stuck trying to rescue what is left of our democracies, trying to preserve our institutions and halt the authoritarian populist wave. But we're having very few conversations about what we would like our societies to look at by 2035. Similarly, Ukraine, having had a resurgence of varieties of nationalism, civic nationalism, ethnic nationalism, the nationalism of online hyper-identity politics. All of these nationalisms clash and get in each other's way and do not culminate in a clear picture of what the Ukraine of the future looks like. So there's a real impoverishment in Ukrainian public discourse around conceptualization of where the country might go. This is enormously difficult to do under the pressures of maniacal aggression from an imperialistic neighbor, but nevertheless it's the case. And anti-Russification and anti-communization, decommunization discourses have not yielded anything like a positive proposal for a future. They've not even yielded any actionable steps, like what counts as decommunization, desovietification, and what doesn't, so that we can act. So none of the actors involved have a conception of the future. Now, a personal remark. Um, I think it's going to be okay, but I'm not very well right now. And so I'm dealing with a lot of symptoms. Just been on oxygen for 5 or 6 hours, and I've frozen. I might unfreeze in a few minutes. Let's see if that happens. Um, and what that does is when you feel a lot of physical symptoms, I'm going to try to relaunch the. I'm going to try to relaunch the video. When you feel a lot of physical symptoms, it's hard to give people the broadest perspectives. What very often happens is that you um, you know focus on why Ricky crossed the road, but you can't see the wider picture of why Ricky you know uh, crossed the road in the sense of where are we at with the way people move around in cities today, and where are we at with, I don't know, whatever it is he was trying to get by, a loaf of bread. Where are we with bakeries today? But I'm going to do my best to stay broad and not have the blinkers on, because we're trying to give ourselves perspective and not just do ongoing news commentary. Let me just relaunch my camera and see if that helps. Just a moment. This has actually never happened on a live. Let me know if you've still got the sound, by the way. I'm just working to quickly get the picture back on. Sounds still good. And then we're going to take some questions, beautiful community. Quite an unusual freeze. We're back. So, having said this broad thing about wide historical processes that we're witnessing that are more than a matter of a year or two, having said something about the lack of a future, let's try to take some questions. Now, another glitch occurred, which is all the questions left before the stream somehow disappeared. But I remember one of them, just from a glance, was about whether the key variables were Ukrainian manpower and mobilization, and whether we're going to see a collapse of that, versus on the Russian side, whether they're going to see a collapse of the Russian economy. I'll keep that question in mind. I bet we'll probably come back to it. It's not a good way of formulating what's at stake, but I'm sure we'll get a chance to comment on it. And if a question on it doesn't come up, I'll circle back myself intentionally. Now, let's have a look. Live chat. Wow, even the questions left at the beginning of this stream have gone. We're going to do our best. I think I also recall some other kind of question, maybe about the prospects of Russian collapse. Why don't we in fact start? Why don't we in fact start there, beautiful community? Let's just start thinking in terms of this very conventional discourse that is all about the idea that Ukraine's got a manpower issue and Russia has an economic collapse issue. Well, let's talk about this. There is such a thing as mental illness. And when we normally talk about mental illness, we talk about various very serious life-altering pathologies that often are accompanied by particular diagnoses one might get from a psychiatrist. But then there are other ways in which we can be mentally not well that, if you like, fall short of that, and it's just up to you dispositionally if you want to call that mental illness or not. And these are just ways in which we fail to face reality or can't bear to face reality, not because it's too complex to understand or we aren't intelligent enough to grasp it, but because we are compulsively drawn to something that stops us from seeing it, or because seeing it doesn't allow us to express ourselves properly, and so we choose not to see it, or half choose not to see it, and so on. So all of these, if you like, deformations that fall short of us being mentally ill, that we're all afflicted by, especially at the time when our Western societies are going through democratic decline, economic decline to some extent. And so one way our pathologies manifest is in this talk about Russian economic collapse. We YouTube creators have an opportunity to have a look at statistics, have a look at what the algorithm would like us to say. And what the algorithm would like me to say is that Russia is about to collapse, and that one kind of collapse it faces is economic collapse. Now, I am actually more of a pessimist than an optimist about the prognosis of the Russian economy relative to expert discourse. At the same time, most of the way we talk about the Russian economy is an expression of magical thinking. People say, we're waiting for Russia to collapse economically. What are we waiting for exactly? In the West, if there was a 5 to 7% contraction of GDP over the course of the year, we'd experience this as a crisis and governments might tumble. We'll call this an economic crisis. Imagine something like that happens in an authoritarian country. What follows from that politically? It's not clear. So the point is that when people talk about an economic collapse in Russia, they're talking about a combination of A, something they can't actually practically describe, and B, political crisis. So economic collapse is in fact a shorthand for regime fragmentation of some kind, secondary or partly secondary to economic factors. Just the idea of the Russian economy collapsing is not an idea that people who talk about it can actually fill in practice. Well, what's going to happen? They're not going to be able to pay their soldiers. Inflation will get out of control. Living standards will plummet. Well, okay, so what? Who will protest about that? What capacity will that have to influence the politics of the regime or destabilize the regime? If they lose the ability to gather up sufficient numbers of people and contract pay them, could they do another forced mobilization? What will be the consequences of that? Maybe they can get away with this, right? So, is there going to be a bailout of major industries by the state that are collapsing because there is a fattening up of the military industrial economy and a systematic diminution of the civilian economy? So stagnation is going to get worse. Inflation is going to get worse. Living standards are going to get worse. What follows from this politically, right? So at the moment, this conversation is completely wrapped up in magical thinking. And in fact, conversations about economic collapse are just conversations that either make no sense at all, or they're conversations that appropriately articulated would actually be retranslated into political collapse. Right? Now, the Russian economy is doing very badly. It is doing badly in a structured and systematic way. Nothing could be a clearer example of that than the fact that they are sending productive young people to do killing and get killed themselves. This bodes extremely badly for Russia's political and economic prospects over the next 5, 10, 15 years. The Russian economy is open to experiencing particular shocks on top of the general stagnation and structural deterioration. What kind of shocks could they be? And what are going to be the political consequences of them, however, is stuff that we need to properly fill out. So, if you're waiting for something that you want to call an economic collapse, you're waiting for a thing that doesn't exist. If you're waiting for a political collapse that's going to be secondary to massive economic deterioration, you're also probably waiting for something that's very unlikely to happen. A political collapse in Russia is going to happen, if it happens, as the result of a multiplicity of factors, of which the economy is likely to be just one. So basically, um, there is no real prospect of something happening to the Russian economy that'll suddenly stop the war or turn it in Ukraine's favor in 2026. That doesn't mean that you're going to get a black swan event of some kind, but what it means is that that is not a mechanism to expect the war to stop. Right? Now, the Ukrainian economy is in a much, much worse state, obviously, than the Russian economy. This is a many, many fold difference. However, there's a very important qualification. The Ukrainian economy is dependent on European support. And as long as that support sustains itself to a certain degree, you're not going to get a catastrophic economic collapse in Ukraine. So that's how I'd weigh the economic situation. We need A, clarity of thought about what we exactly mean by economic deterioration. And B, we need honesty about the fact that we're talking about political collapse, not economic collapse. The other part of the question that I'm recollecting is about manpower in Ukraine. Now, both sides are facing a manpower crisis, but Ukraine's manpower crisis is worse. I'm more qualified to talk about the Russian manpower crisis, so let me make a remark about that. They are not seeing the numbers they want to see brought into the military, especially relative to the losses incurred. However, even though the numbers of people they can pick up are going down and going down relative to what they need, they're not going down to a degree that is incompatible with sustaining the war without doing a major mobilization, probably. That probably might be an expert guess at this point. However, should that prove to be false, my political analysis is that the Russians could get away with another forced mobilization. It'll be destabilizing, and Putin is traumatized by what happened in 2022. Nevertheless, it could be something the regime gets away with. A big deleterious impact on mobilization in Ukraine has been the commitment of the Trump administration to get a peace deal without understanding properly what, in fact, the war is about and what obstacles that there are in the way of a peace deal. If there is a prospect in your mind of the war stopping in 3 to 6 months, you're going to be a lot less motivated to join the military. Another problem around mobilization that Ukraine faces is just that lack of a vision of a future, what it is that we're fighting for, how we're going to get from A to B, and what is the shape of B. What is it exactly that we're fighting for? You can't just fight for territory. You have to fight for a particular outcome for your country, and there needs to be collective clarity about that. And just generally, of course, mobilization is a very, very difficult thing in the modern world. This is not 1914. Um, Most people feel a very high degree of alienation from anything that you might call the call of national duty, even indeed in existential moments. But again, Ukraine is not facing a critical situation to the point that it has to concede uh, a completely unsustainable peace deal. Ukraine is entirely able to keep on fighting um, through 2026 if the only alternatives are deals that are seriously and toxically going to endanger Ukraine's political and economic viability. Let's have a look. There was a question about Zelensky's remark. Oh, yeah, hurricane. I can see it now. Um, Zelensky said that we're in World War III. Do you agree? And what conditions do you think need to be satisfied in order for World War III to have started officially? So there are two separate questions. Are we in World War III? And is it a good idea for Mr. Zelensky, as the president of Ukraine, to say that we are in World War III? The politics of the Zelensky administration from Feb 2022 has been to maximally globalize and internationalize the conflict. We will do everything we can to bring it about that Western nations are forced more rather than less to come into the war. Why? Well, simply because we're going to have more support. Western powers are going to have more at stake. And indeed, Ukraine is structurally interested in an escalation of tensions between Russia and the West that boils over in some way. Why? Because then the West would have to enter the war in a deeper way. So that's Zelensky's politics. So let's think about the efficacy of that politics briefly, because it has two sides to it. Escalating the degree to which everybody is already at war, exaggerating the degree to which everybody is already at war with Russia, could have the effect of bringing Western powers on board. It could also have the opposite effect. In other words, it could simply dilute the distinction between what's a war and what's not a war, such that countries are less rather than more motivated to get involved and back Ukraine systematically. That's a very difficult dilemma that Zelensky faces, and he is making communicative gambles about how to weigh this. But his aim is to implicate the West more deeply in the war. One of Zelensky's weaknesses, and it's come out in all of the learning process that he's gone through in how to deal with the extreme rigidity, impulsivity, and profound narcissistic personality disorder of President Trump. At first, Zelensky was overly confident that he could, as it were, talk Trump down from some of Trump's sort of greatest pro-Russian ludicrousries. That proved to be impossible. But Zelensky generally has a capacity to overestimate how much structural issues can be transcended by very, very sort of unbuttoned and compelling communication. He knows he can't do that with Putin, but he thinks he can do that with Western leaders. And that is a product of his previous career. And it's a kind of a feeling whereby the two or three parties involved in the process tell you, look, this is our commitment, this is our position in response to your question about how many bananas we can send you. This is our response to the question of how many bananas we can grow. And this is our response to sort of conversations about what other fruit we might get or send your way. And Zelensky's sort of subjective feeling is often, okay. That's where we are. But once we get into a room and once we start talking, I believe just in virtue of the direct oomphness of my communication, right? I can shift this. And he's been burned like that a few times. He's also used that talent to early on in 2020 to be able to unify a nation, and in 2022 and 2023 in particular to be an effective advocate for Ukraine on the global stage. A lot of you have been moved by Zelensky's communication, even though his English, is at a kind of a medium level. So this is a quality with strengths and weaknesses, but it can lead to kind of an excessive uh, capacity to be confident one can persuade people of something, even though these people have said they're not open to being persuaded of it. And so some of that is probably going on with his remarks that we're in World War III. Then the second question arises: what would it actually mean for us to be in a world war? Well, a world war does not have to be nuclear, but it would certainly have to be something like an ongoing multi-theater military engagement, direct military engagement between Russia and NATO. And we're not near that. Indeed, alarmists like myself about the prospect of Putin challenging Article 5 at a low threshold, in a low threshold way, would say that Putin doing something in the Baltics, for instance, that challenges Article 5 might still not constitute war, let alone World War III, if the West doesn't respond to it, which would be Putin's intent. So Putin's intent, let me correct that, something like the structural intent of the regime, with intent here taken in quote marks, is that it may need to challenge Article 5 in some way, more direct than anything it's done so far. And the hope there is not to have a war with NATO, but to avoid one. And in avoiding one, to create deleterious consequences in the domestic politics of NATO member states. Because if you challenge Article 5, NATO does nothing. That's an accelerator for democratic decline in Western countries, because it shows that their alliance structure is not just weak, but is ludicrous. Even that you wouldn't necessarily call a war or World War III. So it's probably worth remembering that we live in an age in which we tend to want to use words to mean so many different things that they risk becoming meaningless. And it's healthy to remember that, at least up to a point, everything is what it is and not another thing. So what you would say is that Russia is in a systematic conflict with the West, which is likely to escalate further. It's not necessarily accurate to go on and call it a war. And it is an interesting debate what benefits and downsides there are for Zelensky using that language, but we can be absolutely clear about what Mr. Zelensky is trying to achieve when he uses that language. He's trying to globalize the conflict. Pauli is saying, hey, Vlad, all the current discourse about the war mainly focuses on American and Russian agency, but never Ukraine's. How can we as foreigners put the focus back on Ukraine's own goals and agency? Well, first of all, personally, you can do something by just taking an interest in Ukrainian culture, in Ukrainian history, in Ukrainian domestic affairs. And that's just a nice thing for you to do. Because one of the things that's so strange in this algorithmic niche in which we find ourselves is that so many vehement supporters of Ukraine in this niche know 20 times more about Russia than about Ukraine. If we just did a straw poll of people here who are not Ukrainians, and almost nobody is Ukrainian in my communities. I think 1 or 2% are, and maybe 0.5% of us are. Of people in the community might be from Russia originally or Russian. It's a very small percentage. We're basically an American, Canadian, Antipodean, and then Scandinavian and northern-leaning European audience. But if we did a poll of us Westerners here, how many of us know, you know, anything about the 2 or 3 most powerful people below Zelensky in Ukraine relative to the same question about Russia? I think most of you will be able to answer that question better when it comes to the Russian regime than Ukraine. So that's kind of interesting. Then we have to be realistic and actually understand that the primacy of our conversation politically in the West has to be about us, not about Ukraine. Right? We're not going to support Ukraine because it's good for Ukraine. We're going to support Ukraine because it's good for us. And therefore, it's very important that we have really strong arguments about that aren't just about a picture of what Ukraine might need, independent of a wider perspective of what it means to, I don't know, let's say, prevent a Russo-Chinese quasi-alliance from essentially taking control over security arrangements on the European continent. So what I'm saying is that we do need arguments in the West, when we talk about this politically at least, that start with the West. Obviously, something else you can do in the West is make sure that if there are any Ukrainians around or folks who've left Ukraine, that they feel welcome and well treated in whatever Western country they find themselves in. And you can also, I think, do something else. You can tell Ukrainians, look, I don't need you to paint a made-up and magical picture of your country. I support your country anyway, and I'm curious about it. So, tell me more. I want to know. And don't make that picture all about what you think I want to hear. That's something else you can importantly say. Gwyn is saying it seems that Russia's war against Ukraine has hardened Ukraine into a Spartan military organization, similar to the 1939 attack against Finland and the Arabs' multi-decade efforts against the Jews. I think that we saw a remarkable and utterly devastating, from the point of view of the tyrant in the Kremlin, demonstration of social cohesion in Ukraine in the early months of 2022. What we are seeing now is a degree of politicization. What we're seeing is the political scene in Ukraine coming alive. What we are seeing is that the Zelensky administration increasingly needs to consider domestic stability as a factor even in what it says and does on the foreign stage. That means that more than before, actually, Mr. Zelensky's communication on the international stage is actually aimed at a domestic audience. More than ever, Zelensky's thinking about the largely imitative peace process is also about how do I make sure this does not destabilize my position at home? How do I use it to strengthen my position at home? So there is a kind of a coming alive of the domestic political scene in Ukraine, and that is only going to dramatize over time. There are dangers there. Um, the most positive scenario we can paint is that eventually this politicization will trigger a superior, a relatively superior conversation Ukraine might have with itself, about its future, about where it's going. And so there are two things there. One, how much you consolidate when you're under threat. But two, how much do you have a realistic sense of identity and direction for your polity? And that is a very, very huge challenge for Ukraine going into the future, because it'll be just as hard for Ukraine to win the peace as it'll be to win the war, or to not lose the war in a way that would existentially endanger the sustenance of Ukraine as a political entity. Gen Consensus says every time Zelensky convinces Trump to support Ukraine, the pro-Russian advisors like Witkoff and Vance and Miller gang up on Trump. I would challenge that, because I think that Trump is dispositionally pro-Russian. He's narcissistically dependent on Putin, as we've seen in the video on this channel. By the way, if you're coming from the chat channel, you're rarely here on the so-called main channel. Take a look at the videos around. Maybe you've missed one or two. Do catch up. I'm planning something a little different to slightly reduce the quality of the editing and the production while keeping the quality of the content the same, but post more within my extreme health limitations, post more on the main channel. So Trump's pro-Russian, but more than that, Trump is dispositionally pro-Russian. He's not pro-Russian at the level of lots of particular beliefs he has. And so this business of changing Trump's mind one way and then the other doesn't really apply. He doesn't have a mind to change. He doesn't know anything about Russia. He doesn't know anything about Ukraine. So he doesn't have elaborate positions that are sort of adept to persuasion and re-persuasion. TKM, TK McClone, is a ceasefire more dangerous for Ukraine than no ceasefire, in terms of Russia restarting the war, getting real security guarantees versus a peace deal? Ukraine needs a ceasefire. Ukraine needs a ceasefire badly. But Ukraine does not need a ceasefire and does not need a peace deal so badly that it needs to take them on any conditions, including conditions that are excessively favorable to Russia's aspiration of destabilizing Ukraine's capacity to govern itself over the years to come. So Ukraine is not in a position where it's got to take something now, and it doesn't have a choice. It has a choice. Mr. Putin's position is that a break now would be more favorable to Ukraine than to Russia. But Mr. Putin could be wrong about this. One of the factors that, luckily for us, Mr. Putin underestimates is how much room there is for him to actually stop the war and force a partial reintegration of Russia into the West, which would be catastrophic for the sustenance of Ukraine's sovereignty over the medium term. Because that would allow Mr. Putin to accelerate the election of authoritarian populists in the West. But Putin is a very conservative actor. He's a very cautious actor. He's a very defensive actor. He tends to think of trying to avoid really bad outcomes for himself, as extraordinary as that might sound, given what he started in 2022. And so he lacks the confidence and he lacks the vision to do this. It would be much more damaging to the West if he didn't lack that vision, because he probably could do it. This is quite a complicated question. And when it comes to the more military dimensions, I'm just going to send you off to Jack Watling and uh, Mike Kaufman for a better assessment. In many ways, the answer will not actually be very clear. Can we expect that citizens in liberal democracies rally around the flag in times of crisis and defend their country and way of life if their way of life came under threat the way it did for Ukrainians? Yes, probably less well than Ukrainians, but yes, but less well, and less well than would have been the case in the past. It's very important to admit that we are more atomized than ever politically, and that certain questions that would have, as it were, not even been a question before, do you go and defend your country, are now going to be questions. Do I defend my country, or is there a way for me to emigrate? Is there a way for me to move? Is there a way for me to stay out of this? So uh, the answer is yes, but relative to historical precedent, commitment to fight for your country would be much, much lower now than it would be throughout the history of the 20th century, for instance. So I have a feeling deep down that something is slightly wrong with our chat today, because it feels like I am not seeing things. It's going at about 10 times less relative to the rate we'd have on the chat channel. So that's quite interesting, because we've got 400 plus of us in the room and we're getting very, very few comments coming up. Something is just not adding up about this and I can't work it out. So one of the difficult things we've got to think about is, yeah, I think you're quite right. Maybe it's actually the culture. Maybe it's actually the culture of us doing all our lives on the chat channel, and people maybe not even being subscribed or used to being here on the main channel. So let's just say, if you're here, click the subscribe button, click the bell to be notified of future videos, and feel free to jump into the comment section and not be shy, because normally I get a chance to answer 1 in 20, 1 in 30 questions during a live, because they come so fast, and here there is an opportunity for you to uh, get involved and probably have your question answered if we've got such a slow or strange or glitchy chat today. Now, what's very, very important for us to understand so far of the things we've put on the table is the notion that we are probably not thinking clearly enough when we talk about winning and losing the war. Because if we understand that we are dealing with this very long-term process of the decline of the Russian Empire, if we're dealing through a long-run disintegration of international norms, if we're dealing through a very long journey of nation formation and reformation and reconsolidation in Ukraine, we're actually looking at historical processes that simply cannot resolve themselves in a year or two. And so when we talk about stopping the war, losing the war, winning the war, both parties losing the war, one losing the war less than the other, we miss the fact that the real shape of what is happening is only going to be clear 10, perhaps 15 years from now. And it's important to keep that broader perspective. It's important to understand that even if there is a cessation of the war, that Ukraine will be in a position where it needs to win the peace. And that will too be part of the meaning of the war and part of our understanding of how the war ended. We will need to follow what happens on the Russian space. Even though in the short to medium term, we're not necessarily anticipating any major collapse there, although a regime like Putin's is inherently unstable. It is a regime that is capable of being here today, being gone in 18 months. But we're not seeing any factors to anticipate that happening. So there's a relative degree of stabilization that we're seeing on the Russian space in the short to medium term. But in the medium to long term, things are not looking pretty, right? And I'd go as far as saying that while most of the central arguments for the disintegration of Russia are bogus, and we discussed that in a long form video on this channel about a year or two ago. It's called the video is called "The Prospects of the Breakup of Russia" or something like that. It's got a map of Russia on the black thumbnail. Even though most arguments suggesting that Russia might break up are just bogus and a kind of a version of Twitter activism, particularly ethnic arguments, which miss the point of just how ethnically homogenous Russia is relative to the impression you might get if you're on Twitter. But despite the limitations of all of these arguments, the collapse of the Russian state is in fact a genuine possibility. I'm not with those experts and commentators who believe that since the common arguments for the plausibility of that outcome are often silly or poorly grounded, that it's impossible for that to happen. There's a real prospect of that happening. It might be a minority prospect, but it's in the double digits in percentage terms if we were to have a sort of estimated guess, and not the lowest double digits either. But this is a process that is likely to develop over 10 to 30 years, not 2 or 3 years. So it's incredibly important that if you really want to sit and observe this, and if you really want a positive outcome here for Ukraine, you're not going to have enough popcorn if you've just got a supply for 2 more years. This is going to be a longer run process, and we have to understand that now in February 2026, we are probably approaching the end of the beginning of that process. We're not even in the middle of it yet. It feels like the war has been going on for a long time. It's the length of a world war, the full-scale Russo-Ukrainian war, but still, because what we're seeing is not just a war, we're seeing a war that is an expression of certain global processes, including imperial, Russian imperial decline. It means that we're only going to be in the middle of it a few years from now, and we're not near the end. This is not something that's going to be settled in 6 to 12 months, even if there is a cessation in the active hostilities, in the active Russian aggression against Ukraine. A question from Ukraine. With greater politicization in Ukraine, and lots of political infants who lack both a bigger picture and mature political ideas, how do we help them with their relations with politics in such times? Well, this is very difficult because you don't cultivate a sense of political responsibility in your political actors by saying to them, develop a sense of political responsibility. And they don't cultivate that in themselves by saying, we will develop a sense of political responsibility. Nor do you write a philosophical thesis that then generates political responsibility in practice. There are plenty of political problems that, if you like, political philosophers cannot solve. And these are things to do with trust, to do with perception of the legitimacy of institutions. It's to do with the corruptibility of political actors. One of the strong things in Ukrainian politics that sharply differentiates Ukraine from Russia is that there is a sense that Ukrainian citizens have got to have a say. And if it feels like they don't, and if it feels like what's happening is going against the say they want to have, that they've got to stand up and make themselves counted. So that healthy, active, politicized instinct that encompasses much of the citizenry is important for Ukraine's political health into the future. It doesn't help frame a vision for what the country should be. It doesn't help your institutions be less corrupt. It doesn't help political actors become more responsible directly. But what it can do is just be a matter of one's arm being raised and saying, no, not in our name. This has gone too far. This has gone too far. It's too much. So this is very, very difficult. It's a very difficult question. We're facing the same problem in the West, you see, because we have a decline in our political culture. We have a decline in the quality of people in politics, and we have a decline in the responsibility of people in politics. So one thing to, I think, understand when you're thinking about Ukrainians in politics is that you guys are not alone, and that you guys are being washed up by global forces that affect all of us. You see, when we talk about democratic decline in the West, it's not as though Ukraine is immune from that. Ukraine is facing all of the challenges and all of the social forces that are present in the West that are undermining our democracy. Only the difference is we have much stronger institutions than Ukraine does, and we have more grounded political, more grounded democratic cultures, and in some cases, but not in all cases in the West, political cultures with a history of democracy spanning an important bit of historical time. So understand that we're all in a way in different boats, exposed to the same kind of storm, and so it's important to learn from each other. Another thing that's very important for anybody in Ukrainian politics is to understand how you balance national security with discourse about the future of the country and where the country is going. What you don't want to do is undermine national security. But what you also don't want to do is have a conception of national security that is so broad that it doesn't allow anybody to say anything except the fashionable things to say today. So that's a very important and very difficult balance that needs to be, responsibly uh, struck. Um, but it's very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult to um, cultivate a sense of responsibility in political actors, and it's very difficult to professionalize politics. So, in many ways, I don't actually have an adequate answer for your uh, incredibly important question. But I'm a very big fan of the idea that there can be quite a considerable coexistence between plural discourse and a country in a state of war uh, paying attention, serious attention to national security and making sure it doesn't unnecessarily undermine itself and shoot itself in the foot. Um, you can't have a completely free public sphere in a time of war, but in the kind of war that Ukraine is engaged in right now, there's probably more room for free, pluralistic, competitive exchange of political ideas. But it also needs to be responsible. It needs to be predicated on the notion that you're dealing with political opponents, not with enemies. You can't substantively disagree, but every time you substantively disagree, call the other person somebody who's a traitor and who's ruining your country. Right. So what's very important is that you don't extrapolate this notion of um, traitor or somebody who is devoid of certain patriotic virtues. You don't extrapolate that onto people who disagree with you about, if you like, the Ukraine of the future, or about how to solve a political challenge. Traitors are people who are basically um, uh, directly supporting the Kremlin's attack on Ukraine. Right? A traitor is not somebody who disagrees with you about uh, what policy needs to be implemented in an important domain. Right? So that's very, very important. Um, it can't be that every political disagreement is a loyalty test. Do you think that if Russia destabilizes, Gaffer Bob says, China will seek to informally reclaim Russian occupied uh, 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 Chinese territory in quote marks with peacekeepers or secure loose nukes? Um, it's very important that I'm in a place to speak with considerable depth and cultural sensitivity when it comes to the Russian space. This is absolutely not the case with China. Um, Russia's dependence on China is deepening and uh, becoming very problematic for Russia's medium term future. Having said this, there are plenty of indirect ways for the Chinese to influence what happens on the Russian space without direct acquisition of that space. So this is something that we're probably only going to see in a situation where there isn't a kind of peeling at the edges, but there is indeed very major disintegration on the Russian space. And I do think there is a prospect of that, but it's only under the unlikely but possible scenario that that occurs um, that we could have that conversation realistically. Give me more questions, beautiful community. We have an overload on the chat channel, but here we have an insufficiency, even though there's quite a lot of us in the group. It's an opportunity for you to get your question answered, which is rare because we don't manage to do that on chat. We have, probably a 10% success rate there because um, I can't keep up in just an hour, hour and a half. So use this opportunity, beautiful community. Now, what is, I think, really important psychologically about the political point I made a moment ago, that we're witnessing a long process that's going to develop over a course of not just years, but decades. What's important about that psychologically is that um, it's only if we have a tangible sense of what kinds of historical currents we're swimming in that we are going to feel sane when we observe all of this. Right? Unless we keep exploring what this is all about, what larger historical forces are driving this, we're going to lose that sanity. That's expressed sometimes in people quitting politics, quitting interest in politics. It's expressed sometimes in people quitting a particular political interest, right? A lot of people have left the pro-Ukrainian space over the last 2 or 3 years. They're sort of active online the first year or two, and then they've had enough or moved on to something else. And it's also just terribly bad for your mental health to keep viscerally engaged with something that is overwhelming insofar as it is not making sense. And it's that not making sense issue that's really a problem. It's not that things are going badly and therefore you feel overwhelmed, you can't deal with. Very often you can. You just hope that they can get better. You reflect on what can make them better and you go on. But when something is just not making sense to you, that's when it becomes corrosive. And that's when you are likely to tune out or to remain tuned in, but in a less constructive and a more destructive way. You're likely to lose the plot a little bit. And so that longer run perspective that we've just discussed is not just about curiosity. It's not just about information. It's not just about historical context or understanding. It's also about your psychological sanity, right? What is this that we're looking at? How long is it going to take? And what are possible historical analogies that we could bring to bear, and then point out ways in which we rely on them and ways in which we shouldn't rely on them. Let's say a little bit about where Vladimir Putin is at today. Unfortunately, so much depends on the whims of the tyrant in the Kremlin. Now, Russia certainly has a problem with its regime, and not just in the instantiation of the figure of Putin being dependent on foreign escalation for regime security. But having said this, despite the fact there is this dependence, if we go back to February 2022 and ask a question like, which member of Putin's Security Council would have started a full-scale war against Ukraine, thinking about them one by one, I can't think of one who would have. Certainly Mr. Patrushev, who Mark Galeotti calls the Hawk of Hawks, wouldn't have started a full-scale war against Ukraine, in my assessment. So, for all of the systemic factors at hand, for all of the pathologies of Russian imperialism, a lot of what happens here simply depends on what a particular individual is thinking and then chooses to do. So it's worth reflecting on where Mr. Putin is at. Right now, my experience, and this is interpretation because we can't access the Kremlin very easily at all at the moment, but my assessment is that Putin is quietly confident about the next year or two. He is confident because he believes that his regime can sustain the war for another year. He's confident because he has an exaggerated sense of the prospect of some kind of political collapse in Ukraine. And he's confident because he genuinely thinks we're all going to vote the AfD, Nigel Farage, into power. We're going to vote authoritarian populists into power all over the West and are going to renormalize relations with Russia. He thinks that's an inevitability and it's going to work itself out in the course of the next half a decade to a decade. He is stressed by the economic degradation Russia is facing. He finds it hard work to think about, but I don't think he is scared of it or overwhelmed by it. He still puts it in the box of a real difficulty that people I'm going to outsource this to are going to deal with for me. And deal with means this shouldn't come to threaten my power. Putin remains unsure about what to do with Trump. He realizes that, although he wouldn't put it like this, that Trump seems to have a kind of narcissistic dependence on him. He realizes that Trump aligns with him much more than the rest of the US political system does, but is also cautious and scared to get too close to Trump because he thinks that Trump is here today, gone tomorrow. He also thinks that Trump doesn't necessarily have the power to turn around the ship of the US state, if you like. So he is very impressed and very enamored by Trump's advances, but is also uncertain and unconfident. Trump is not an object that Putin feels he can lean on comfortably because he could just be gone tomorrow and you would have leaned on something that simply disappeared. Putin remains very paranoid about being overthrown. I believe he would have seen recent developments in Iran with a visceral emotional response. He has considerable trauma about the political endings of Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, and doesn't want this to happen to him. And he's thinking about how to be as preemptive about this as possible. He's thinking about preempting the preempting steps of it. He's wanting to be preemptive on the multiplicity of layers, because that is his central end and the thing he's most afraid of. He's now delusional enough to think that Russia's fate is conjoined with his fate historically, and therefore he thinks whatever is good for him is good for the country, even if it means that a section of the population has to be sacrificed for his ends, even if it means that much of the rest of the population has to live in an economically declining predicament. That doesn't matter to Putin much. It's a few people here and there. And quite frankly, everybody will get over themselves once the history books are written 200 years from now. So, for all of the concerns Putin has about how to deal with Trump, about how to preempt challenges to his regime at home, about how to deal with Russia's relationships on the foreign stage. For all of that, he is actually primarily just in a dialogue with himself. He's communing with himself and sort of floating above geography, floating above history, and reflecting in a quasi-mystical way on how the history books will settle all of what he's doing. Now, I think there was a question above that also just disappeared about Putin. And I've forgotten what it is, but let me try to see if I can get it back. No, I don't have it. I think it may have been about Putin's capacity to change his mind on how he sees what's happening. Yes, I've got it. Um, is Putin impacted? That was the question. I'm so sorry. I should have perhaps extracted these questions, not knowing that they disappear. Yes, is Putin thrown by the numbers of Russian soldiers that are being seriously wounded to the point of being taken out of action, and indeed number of Russian soldiers losing their lives? The answer is he absolutely doesn't give a hoot. Um, this guy does not care at all. If you 10x'd the number of Russian casualties and told Putin that his regime is still going to be stable, he wouldn't bat an eyelid. Because he thinks he's basically feeding these people into a very big historical blender and mixer. And essentially, all of these losses are just going to be washed out by history. They're going to be washed out by the fact that he was a gatherer of lands of some kind. So he doesn't give a hoot. And unfortunately, it's also the case that I don't see remotely at this level, at this casualty rate, the Russian population getting activated about the degree of the losses. Part of the reason for that, this could change partly, but only partly with another forced mobilization. Part of the reason for this is that when it comes to contract soldiers, the Russian population, without articulating this, sees this as a kind of hyper neoliberal business deal. In other words, if you're paid by the state to go to war and kill people and get killed, most Russians tend to think of that as a private business deal. If there are going to be bad consequences, you're going to be bearing them because you entered the deal where there were prospects of advantages and disadvantages, and luck was involved. But it's not a feeling that these people are doing something for Russia. For all the state propaganda, Russians don't think Russian soldiers are doing anything for Russia. The number of Russians who think Russian soldiers are doing anything for Russia probably is going to tap out at 10-15%. These people are just engaged in a business deal. And that's a very strange thing for us. They're perceived as being engaged in a business deal with the state as individual entities. And that is remarkable because it's almost a way of conceiving of the Kremlin the way Ukraine conceives of the Kremlin, as just a power. As just a power that is projecting itself across territory that is your own and not theirs. Whereas the Russians think, well, the Kremlin is a kind of power and it sort of has control over this territory and we're on it and blah, that's where we are. So it's a very, very colonization-driven psychology. The Kremlin is not so much my government as the power that happens to be on this territory, and I'm on it, and I'm in a negotiation with it. And I hope what this power is doing is good. I don't even understand what it's doing, but I hope that what it's doing is good. There's a great deal of inferred justification there. We don't know why this war is happening, but I hope it wouldn't happen for no good reason at all, so there must be some reason for it. Right. So we're very, very far removed from the idea that the Russian population wakes up feeling that people have been fighting for their country and have been needlessly sent to do that and needlessly sent to kill neighbors. Just having a look at where we are. Am I still not asking questions? Beautiful community. Well, I'm going to take this as an invitation for main channel lives to be self-propelling rants than from me. And we're going to take all the questions on the other channel. Let's take a question from Alex. Hi, Vlad. If Putin sees Trump as a symptom of American decline, isn't it paradoxical that a leader more aligned with Putin wouldn't be viewed that way? Does Putin not see himself in Trump? With my slow brain, let me try to read that again. if Putin sees Trump as a symptom of American decline, isn't it paradoxical that a leader who is aligned with Putin wouldn't be viewed that way? Does Putin not see himself in Trump? Let me try, and I'm not sure I fully captured your meaning. So, what we mean when we say that Putin wants Western decline is that Putin wants the decline of Western democracy. Even that's not quite accurate, because that's on our terms. We believe we have democracies that are in many ways compromised, flawed, some ways captured, in some ways corrupt, but they're real. Putin doesn't think they are real. Putin doesn't think democracy exists at all. So when we act out concepts like political opposition, which is a concept of cooperation through conflict rather than just a relation of enemies, when we act that out, Putin thinks we're just making it up. We're going through motions. We're delusional. There is no democracy. It's a politics of enemies all the way down, as long as you look properly. And so, in a certain sense, what we call Western decline and what we say Putin is looking for is not Western decline on Putin's terms. You see, for Putin, the West is not in decline if it's full of Viktor Orbáns running Germany, France, and the UK. That's quite good for him. And that's a kind of an expression of realistic politics with the froth of, democratic fakery blown from atop the glass. He wants to destabilize our societies now. He wants to dramatize conflicts we're having between ourselves in our societies, so that we lose our democracy, so we lose what we call our democracies. But once Viktor Orbáns are in power everywhere, the West is not an enemy anymore, and the West doesn't need to decline or collapse or disintegrate. So that's how I'd frame that. Does Putin see in Trump a sort of ally? At a personal level, no, because Putin does not rate Trump. Putin thinks Trump is an idiot. Putin thinks Trump has done some things well, but he roughly thinks Trump is not competent, that Trump is not able to systematically have oversight over issues. Don't forget, Putin is able to recite the statistics, often there'd be lies, but he's able to recite the statistics relative to what is happening in the world, what is happening in Russia, in a way that is short of, but almost begins to go toward the level of Bill Clinton. Far above the capacity of Keir Starmer to do so. So Putin is a leader of an illegitimate mafia-like regime, but he has areas of very competent hackery. And he sees all of that absent in Trump. Putin is in many ways a details guy. And Putin, in many ways, is a procedure guy. He loves talking about procedure. Even when he orders the elimination, assassination of his political opponents, he'd still be interested in procedure. He wouldn't say, take that guy out. He would say, let's, empower the appropriate agencies to delegate the relevant resources to take commensurate action for the preservation of the stability of the state, and so on. And so he thinks Trump is just a useless buffoon. Structurally, he does think that there's quite a bit there. He very much welcomes the fact that Trump is trying to align with him. He also understands that Trump has a big ego and loves modeling himself on authoritarian leaders around the globe. Putin gets all of that. So that's an affinity. because he sees that Trump also recognizes that democracy isn't real. They're both monarchists. They both don't see why the power of the person at the top should be checked in any way. And Putin thinks that he is a sort of a brotherly with Trump in that way, even though he personally doesn't rate Trump very much. But what Trump clearly lacks and Putin has is a vision. Putin has a vision of a long range historical kind about where the world should go and about where uh, Russia should go. There's nothing like that in Trump. And so Putin thinks that Trump is sort of essentially politically unserious. He doesn't have a picture where he wants things to go. Putin's picture is delusional. It's full of magical thinking. It's full of proposals that aren't real proposals. The Putin regime doesn't have anything substantive to offer any of its neighbors except violence. It doesn't have much to offer its own citizens either, except the barest security. The Putin regime is, I suppose, better for Russians than anarchy. But for all that, Putin has very big historical ideas. And he sees Trump as lacking these. So that would be my perspective on how Putin sees the orange monster child. So one of the things that Putin ends up underestimating is the fact that democratic decline in the West means that our societies are so atomized with our social bonds, so untethered that we struggle with solidarity and the public good, that our discourse is completely upside down and is stuck on these awful social media platforms that compel us into incommensurable mental worlds. We have huge crises of economic exclusion and a deep perception citizens feel that their politics and their economy are just sort of occurring in a completely non-consultative way with them, even though they theoretically have the right to vote. But for all of these social forces, so we could name more, which are triggering decline in our democracies, that are triggering diminution in trust. What Putin is not getting is that our democracies are real after all, and that democracy does not collapse just because it is in crisis. Right? What Putin does not get is that when a Western democracy gets into crisis, it could collapse, but it could also survive. He is underestimating the potential for resilience in our democracies because he doesn't think they're real. But if they are real, then it's clear that the history of democracy shows that democracies don't just melt away when they're being bashed up. So that's one way I think in which Putin is really missing us, and that contributes to his partly delusional optimism about his own prospects, even though unfortunately, in some ways, his positive ideas about his prospects are not entirely wrong. And the way this possibility to balance the fact that yes, our democracies are entering crisis, but no, they don't have to necessarily all collapse because of that. The way to balance this is by reflecting on two distinct things. One is institutional resilience, and the other is political culture. And in some countries, institutional resilience will be less, but political culture will be a bit better, a bit democratically healthier. In other countries, it'll be the other way around. So the United States is probably the most democratically sick of the major Western democracies, but it is also the one with a really high degree of institutional resilience. And while we are going to see institutional degradation over the years to come, and even greater assaults on institutions than what the Trump administration is doing right now, we're also going to see episodes of conflict triggered by significant institutional resilience and backlash against authoritarian attempts to wash institutions away. All of that Putin doesn't quite see. An interesting thought I had, because we did this video on the main channel about what Putin is been trying to do with the winter siege of Ukraine. This was engaged in a kind of Orwellian psychological warfare on Ukraine, whereby he wanted Ukrainians to accept Russian aggression as a sort of natural disaster, just a fact about the world, because it's now year 5 and it's still happening. And how can we do anything to change who's in the Kremlin? And so, if it's a natural disaster, we need to start talking about ourselves. What are we doing wrong here, right? If our heating is off, can we blame our government? Maybe can we blame our local authorities? And so, that's a kind of a decentering of the clarity that the central cause of what's happening is because an aggressor is doing something. And that's a psychology that Putin wanted to trigger in Ukrainians with his winter siege. Another element of the psychology he wanted to trigger is just a sense of futility. There's been a long time, and that, as you can see, I'm not stopping. And so maybe you need to start asking questions about whether it's even ethical for you to carry on resisting because it's causing a lot of misery for your citizens in the name of freedom and dignity. And then, thirdly, can't you see that the West is not with you? Can't you see that Trump has allowed me to keep bombarding you and pressing you over the course of a year while talking about a mostly imitative peace process? So you have been abandoned by the West. And so, what I wanted to say, having just summed up that video a little bit, which is the last video on the channel from 3 or 4 days ago, is that Putin right now is sitting there thinking, okay, this hasn't really worked this winter. You've done a lot to degrade Ukraine's energy system, but it's not politically broken the country. Why don't I just try that again next year? Next time lucky. It'll be a year where there's more pressure on Ukraine. I'm still probably going to be sitting here stably, but goody, I am going to try this thing again. Because after all, Ukraine's governability has to collapse at some point, right? So that's also what Putin is thinking at this point. TK McClone again. In my experience, progressive left creators skew toward not following the war or propaganda narratives. It's selective outrage. Why is there no moral obligation to get Ukraine right versus Gaza? I'm not sure it's easy to generalize about getting Ukraine right versus getting Gaza right. A lot of people get one right and the other wrong. And I am still promising a long, sort of 1 or 2 hour chat about the West's moral shame in Gaza, if you like. We'll do that on the chat channel because we haven't deeply updated ourselves since, quite frankly, the end of 2023 on this. Now, one of the problems with commentators, if your question is about commentators, is that inherently internet commentators can't comment on foreign policy well. Why? Because if you are sitting in the UK and you're talking about news that comes out about China, Japan, India, Russia, Israel, it's just you sitting on your butt in your living room or in your bed, in my case, for health reasons. how the hell are you going to know what's going on in all of these parts of the world? You don't. You probably can know quite well what's happening in your country. Doesn't matter whether your views about it are good or bad, but um, you're probably going to be reasonably well informed. It's a good chance of that. But it's hard to be well informed because even if you're a show, you're not just one person, you're a show with 3 or 4 people involved. You don't have any foreign correspondence. You can't send somebody to Ukraine for 3 months to report. You can't send somebody to the West Bank to report for you. You're not the New York Times. So quite frankly, how do you know? And often there is this very big gap just in sheer friction with reality when people report on foreign news who are hosts of YouTube shows. Now, that's partly why I'm very conservative when it comes to talking about China or when it comes to talking about domestic politics in Germany and France, right? Um, because quite frankly, my platform allows me to do that. So I'll sort of boost this up a bit into a dramatic example. I work 1 or 2 hours a day from bed for reasons of my extreme health challenges. But if I were healthier and I could spend more time talking about more things, I could start talking about China tomorrow. And within 6 to 12 months, I'd be on the radio and on TV talking about China, knowing nothing about it at all, except stuff I'd learned effectively on Wikipedia. That's entirely possible, right? It's possible to get on the expert circuit. There are some really great voices on Times Radio, by the way, talking about Russia, but there are also some voices on Times Radio on their circuit talking about Russia regularly. We have no clue about Russia at all. So there is that, right? I'm talking about Russia, but I tried my hand at 3 degrees in politics and philosophy. I speak Russian. I have not ever lived in Russia because I only lived in the Soviet Union, but I visited Russia. So I have a freakish relationship with that country. And even still, I talk about it in more general terms when it comes to concepts of authoritarianism, concepts of ideology, concepts of regime variety, ideas about regime stability. Right? I don't do 2-hour lectures on the internal workings of the Wagner organization. So that's just one problem. We've got a lot of people talking about foreign policy who have quite a relatively shallow conception of it relative to their grasp of domestic policy. Then we have a situation whereby, as a result of this, what you in fact develop as your quote unquote views on certain conflicts aren't actually views on these conflicts, but are generic applications of ideological principles. So, for instance, the military industrial complex is bad, therefore we shouldn't support Ukraine. This is not a view about Ukraine, it's a view about the military industrial complex. It's a general view about US foreign policy. But you don't have the chops to actually concretely apply that principle to a set of particular cases and then judge what its implications are in those cases. You just sellotape the issue to the principle. So there's a lot of that. Then, when it comes to consistency across issues, I myself practice it, but I am not, if you like, too extreme in how I demand that from you because I understand it's a complex world. It might be that you can grasp what's going on in Sudan and Gaza, but you might not grasp what's going on in 7 other parts of the world. You can't be everywhere. So there is a kind of economy of ethical sentiment, which means you can't ask people to be proportionate in the allocation of ethical energies. Right? You just can't do that. It's just not realistic. And so I often think it's better for people to be constructively engaged with one issue than none. And you see, the objection often comes, well, if you constructively engage with this, why aren't you also constructively engaged with that? But in practice, the realistic alternative to being constructively engaged with the one thing is not that you're going to be constructively engaged with all the things, it's that you're going to be constructively engaged with nothing. So you've got to be realistic about this slider. When you press people, come on, you're good on Ukraine, but you're terrible on Gaza. What's going on? Very often the alternative is not to develop consistency across the issues, but just to lapse out altogether and stop caring about anything. There's a special case, of course, with Ukraine and Gaza, namely that we are involved, right? Especially the United States. And that creates a difficulty, namely that you are in a special way, not guilty, of course, but responsible as a US citizen for what Israel has done in response to the barbarism of October 7th in Gaza. Same goes for the UK, my country, but to a lesser extent. I think that it's also important that, you know, Israel is not Ukraine or Russia. And Gaza is not Ukraine or Russia. You're not going to be able to make straight analogies between the two. I do think that there is a special problem in the translation here from Ukraine to Gaza, namely that Russians, and to a lesser extent Ukrainians, but also Ukrainians, tend to be hugely Israel sympathetic. And that means that the Russian opposition and then many Ukrainian voices basically, unfortunately, do not have the capacity to properly grasp what's actually happened in Gaza. And that's an unfortunate part of how this works out in practice. There is also then a very big gap between Europe and the United States. In the United States, it's a little bit more culturally normal to essentially take an ethnic cleansing position on Gaza. Whereas to a European perspective, that looks absolutely nuts. So there is a kind of huge pro-Israeli disposition that blinds people to properly seeing what is the balance of proportionality in that conflict and in that part of the world. So these are some thoughts, but I promise I'm going to give a lot more on Gaza in a long chat on the chat channel soon. So let me see. If you don't want to ask me more questions, I'm going to make a couple of more general remarks to try to ground us. And then I'm going to see you probably on the chat channel for the next live, where you're going to bombard me with questions I can't answer. So this is the absurdity of our situation. But it's quite interesting. It's quite a fascinating, whatever this is, cultural gap between the channels. So this is I'm probably going to use this as a result now more for content rather than Q&A answers. In this world, beautiful community, where live content is going to become ever more important when we are increasingly insecure about AI. Now, let me say a few words about something that I think we probably do need an update on when we're talking about the 4 years of war, is where are the Russian people in this? We talked about the radical depoliticization of the Russian people in a video called "The Real Reason Russians Don't Protest" or something like that. And I think it's a video with the thumbnail of me sitting in a kind of red suit on the bed. I think it's one of the higher viewed ones, probably over 500,000 views. So you can just find it by clicking most popular and be near the top on this channel. Has something fundamentally changed in where the Russian people are at relative to a year or two ago, or not? What's fundamentally not changed is the breakdown into the three buckets, which we started talking about, right from the beginning together. That there is a very small bucket of people who are more pro-war than Putin, in the sense that they want not just war, but effective war. And they want victory. And that probably taps out at about under 20% of the population. Quite a bit under 20%. Then there is another 20% or under category of people who are substantively against the war. And these people are not just people who don't like the war or feel fatigued from the war. They think the war is being done for particular reasons, which they vehemently oppose. That's under 20%. And then there is a blob of 60% in the middle who basically do not have an opinion on the war. They do not have an opinion on most things Putin does, but they outsource power to Putin and hope, in virtue of some kind of inferred justification, that he's doing the right thing. That's to say, they hope that while they don't know why the war is happening, that Putin started it for good reasons, though they may never know what they are, and that he's continuing it with a degree of rationality and efficacy that is commensurate with getting into something that's such a big deal. So they can't name reasons for or against the war because they don't believe they can even be part of that conversation. It's something that is not to do with them. It happens beyond them. It's an outsourcing of politics to this sort of monarchist, quasi-colonial figure of power. What has changed is that there is, I think, a general degree of fatigue with the war, but it is undifferentiated. It does not translate into any clear position, and it does not translate into any clear practical ask or practical aspiration. So, therefore, the crisis of deep depoliticization remains, and there is no current prospect, despite the incremental bits of politicization that the regime is doing, because the regime is dependent on both deep depoliticization but also a degree of politicization, because you have to partly spend some of the time telling people this war thing is good. But very roughly speaking, there is no prospect of currently the Russian population waking up from its depoliticized slumbers. And the chief factor here is the perception of being able to make a difference, more than actually in the ultimately real political repression. It's that people don't think that there's anything they can do that can inflect the direction of this from A to B. Now, I'm going to have a more detailed conversation about this, but that's sort of my 4 years of war infinitesimal update. We've got Rachel in the house. Rachel's been on a Vlad sabbatical, and she's saying hello. And somebody's saying comments are being deleted, Vlad. You know what? It's possible that I haven't checked my settings and that I'm on some kind of a weird safety setting here that I can't access from where I am right now. That means that some people are writing comments that are not appearing. That's entirely possible. All I can do is promise to fix that by the next time we are together, beautiful community. Now, likewise, something else that hasn't changed is the need for the West to keep keep putting pressure on Russia, the need for the West to be understanding what it means to make the sanctions regime more complete and more efficacious, and the need to make Russia understand that Ukraine is going to remain at least minimally militarily supported, such that there'll be no prospect of, by sheer military means, depriving Ukraine of its sovereignty. We also need to take serious care around Russia's engagement with us in ways we'd call sort of hybrid conflict. And we need to do all of this and take the Russian threat seriously without conflating domestic political issues that divide us with the Russian threat. One of the difficulties we've got is that our talk, especially in Europe, is ahead of our action. And that we're partly in a predicament where we're using artificial talk that fabricates commitment, to get ourselves into a practical position where we are more engaged and more committed. That's a difficult predicament. And often in difficult historical moments, in moments where leaders and governments feel powerless, you resort to fabricated optimism, to fabricated determination as a way of trying to generate some real optimism and real determination. We're seeing a lot of that in Western politics. And the trouble with it is that on the one hand, it might help galvanize us, but on the other hand, because it comes with this gap between words and reality, it has the effect of undermining trust. And the biggest point that I keep coming back to on the channels is that there is a connection between what we can do on the foreign policy stage and the strength of our democracies. The best way to help Ukraine, but also the best way to help our foreign policy, and the best way to help the process of negotiating the disintegration of the post-1989 global order in a minimally devastating way, the best way to do all of this is to engage as much as possible in the halting of democratic decline and in partial democratic regeneration at home. This is the paradox. What Ukraine depends on, funnily enough, is the sustenance and strength of Western democracies, especially European democracies, if the United States is now going off orbit. But the trouble is that what's happening in the United States is potentially only an election cycle away from happening in many West European countries. So that's the difficulty we face. But we've got to understand that there is very little point in us giving lectures to ourselves about how we need to stop being useless on the international stage, about how we need to develop willpower to act coherently on the international stage, in detachment from the reality of the crises we democratically face at home. It's only that if we get better at the domestic challenges that we will be able to be stronger and not be run over by the likes of Putin on the foreign stage. And that requires the understanding that the current response to right authoritarian populism or ex-right authoritarian populism isn't okay. Because the current response in the main is technocratic centrism that wants to give us just more technocratic centrism and worse, of a more cautious and defensive and conservative variety. The irony is that technocratic centrism is one of the causes of populist post-truth anti-democratic authoritarianism, and that it thinks that now that it's assailed by this thing that it in part gave birth to, the best thing to do is just to keep doing more of the same, and in an even more lame and lamentable way. We'll do what we were doing in 1998, but now more conservatively and more defensively. And we're going to take a stance, and we're not going to articulate a vision, and we're not going to do a strong policy commitment, because what if somehow that increases the chances of us losing to the authoritarian right, the authoritarian X-right. So paradoxically, we've got a situation where a politics that's part of the cause of what's wrong is giving something that is even worse than its old self, that partly caused the problem that we have, as the solution. We've got to begin snapping out of this dynamic where the only two alternatives are a sort of dying technocratic centrism or a completely grotesque, irresponsible, exclusionary, authoritarian populism. It's only if we develop some third force in our politics, some third project. I'm going to talk about exactly what that might look like in detail. I hope to do a video in the main channel about what a responsible but yet electable politician might look like in the late 2020s. It's only if we do better at getting beyond these two unpalatable alternatives, right? That we're going to be able to be stronger on the international stage. Now, don't forget, just because these two alternatives are unpalatable doesn't mean that they're as bad as one another. I would have gone out of my way if I were a US citizen to vote for Kamala Harris against Donald Trump. So you absolutely do still go for the awful technocratic centrism if the only thing on the menu is that or authoritarian populism. But the trouble is that's just not a sustainable equation, because eventually the right populism, ex-right populism, will just win. Beautiful community. It's been lovely to be with you. We're going to fix the situation we had with questions. I don't know how far this is a difference of technicality or me being on upsetting or just a difference in culture. But we're going to talk soon. Thank you so much for being with me. And I hope that the few broad brushstrokes we sort of deployed today have been in some way clarifying or of help. Lots of love and talk very soon.